They called her too ugly to marry. Then he removed the sack and his heart stopped. Western romance. The wind carried dust across the barren plain, whispering against the dry fence posts and the rusted gate that hadn't been touched in years. The sun hung low, pale and tired, painting the land in shades of faded gold. A lone rider moved slowly through the stillness, his horse's hooves pressing deep into the dirt, steady but uncertain, as if the animal too felt the weight of the silence. His name was Eli Carter, a rancher whose world had grown small since the war took his brothers and left his fields empty. He didn't talk much anymore. Didn't have to. The land didn't listen anyway. He was headed back from town when he saw it, a shape near the old well behind Miller's barn, something half buried in dust and shadow. At first, he thought it was just a sack of grain, or maybe some junk left to rot. But then it moved, just a little. He stopped his horse, the reins trembling in his hand, and listened. The wind shifted. A faint whimper broke through it, soft, human, and scared. Eli dismounted slowly, his boots crunching the dirt. As he got closer, the outline became clear. A figure tied at the wrists, slumped against the wooden post, a rough sack covering the head. The dress was torn, stained with soil and dried blood. Her shoulders shook with shallow breaths. He froze. For a moment, he just stood there, staring, caught between disbelief and pity. No sound came from her except the fragile rhythm of her breathing. The world around them was quiet. No birds, no cattle, no life. Only the sound of the wind brushing past the fence wires like a ghost. He stepped closer, one hand hovering above the sack, afraid to touch. Whoever had done this didn't mean her to be found. When he finally pulled the sack away, the air seemed to stop moving. His heart stumbled. The woman beneath was young, bruised and scarred, but her eyes, they were something else entirely. Eyes that carried both terror and defiance, the kind that made a man remember what mercy felt like. Eli let out a slow breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Whatever had happened here wasn't over, and now he was part of it. The woman didn't speak. She only stared at him through the tangled strands of her hair, her eyes flickering between fear and confusion, as if she couldn't decide whether he was another monster or a miracle that came too late. Eli knelt beside her, his hands hovering just above her shoulders, unsure if touching her would comfort or shatter her completely. The ropes around her wrists were rough, tied tight enough to cut skin. He took his knife out slowly, the blade trembling against the cord. "Easy now," he whispered, his voice more breath than sound. She flinched at the first touch of freedom, but didn't move away. When the last rope fell, she folded into herself, curling her arms around her body, as if afraid the world might hurt her again the moment she looked up. Eli looked at her, the dirt, the bruises, the silence, and something deep inside him began to ache, something he thought he'd buried with his brother in a war he never understood. He remembered the smell of gunpowder, the screaming, the women who used to wait by the road for news that never came. He remembered finding a girl once, years ago, on a burnt field, too late then too. Maybe that's why this one hurt more, because she was still alive. He looked around, no tracks, no wagon, no sign of who'd left her there. Just the quiet hum of the wind and the distant call of a crow. He knew what kind of men did this. He'd seen them before, the kind that took what they wanted and left behind what couldn't scream anymore. Every instinct told him to walk away. This wasn't his fight. He had no space in his life for anyone else's ghosts, but her silence followed him even when he turned his back. He took a few steps toward his horse, but the sound of her breathing, shallow and uneven, made him stop. He'd been alone too long, but not so long that he'd forgotten what helplessness sounded like. The sun was starting to fall, and the cold would come soon. She wouldn't last the night. Eli stood still, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. "All right," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. "You'll come with me, just till you can stand again." He wrapped his coat around her shoulders and lifted her gently into his arms. She didn't resist, only trembled once before going completely still, like a small bird that had given up fighting the wind. As he placed her on the saddle, something in him shifted quietly. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but for the first time in years, Eli Carter rode home with a heartbeat beside his own. The first night at the ranch was restless. The woman didn't speak a word, not even when Eli offered her water or a blanket by the fire. She sat in the corner of the cabin, knees to her chest, staring at the flickering light, as if it might suddenly burn her too. Eli didn't press her. He'd seen that look before, the hollow stare of someone who had been stripped of trust. He simply watched from his chair, the ticking of the old clock filling the silence between them. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of hooves, faint but deliberate. He stepped to the window, hand on his rifle. Only the moonlight touched the empty yard, but something in his gut tightened. Trouble had a way of finding those who were already broken. By morning, she was gone. Panic cut through his chest before he saw her out by the barn, trying to fetch water with trembling hands. When she noticed him, she froze, guilt flashing in her eyes. "You shouldn't have brought me here," she whispered finally, her voice dry and fragile, as if unused for years. Eli frowned, surprised she could even speak. "Why?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, her jaw tightening before she said the words that would change everything. "They'll come." It took the rest of the day before she told him, in short, trembling sentences that sounded like memories she wished weren't hers. Her name was May. She had been promised to a man twice her age, a cattle merchant who'd bought her father's debt and claimed her as payment. When she ran, they found her, tied her up, and left her to die as a warning. Eli felt the heat rise in his chest, that familiar anger that came when men turned life into currency. He'd seen it in war, seen it in trade. Now it had come home. As dusk fell, Eli noticed new tracks near the fence, not his horses, not hers. 3 sets of boots, fresh in the dirt. They hadn't been there that morning. He looked toward the horizon. Dust hung low like smoke. They were coming. He turned back to the cabin, to the woman sitting inside with fear written all over her face. He'd made a choice once, to walk away from people, from pain, from anything that made him feel human again. But now she was here, and her danger had become his. He loaded the rifle, the sound sharp in the still air. "If they're coming," he said quietly, "then they'll find more than what they're looking for." May's eyes met his for the first time without fear, and for a moment the silence between them felt like an unspoken promise that neither of them would run again. The sun sank behind the hills, and somewhere out there men rode with greed in their hearts and bullets in their pockets. The storm had found them both. For days after the tracks appeared near the fence, neither of them spoke much. The threat hung in the air like a storm that refused to break. Still, something quiet began to grow between them, not through words, but through the simple rhythm of surviving side by side. Each morning, Eli would light the fire, boil water, and leave a cup near where May sat. At first, she wouldn't touch it until he'd gone outside. But by the 3rd morning, when he came in from the barn, he noticed the cup empty and washed, resting beside his own. He didn't smile, but something in his chest softened. By noon, she followed him to the field. Her steps were small, hesitant, but deliberate. Eli didn't ask why. He just handed her an old pair of gloves and pointed toward the fence. She worked beside him, tightening loose wires, the silence between them filled only by the creak of posts and the breath of wind. Once she pricked her finger on a rusted nail, and when he reached to help, she pulled away too fast, fear flashing across her face like lightning. He didn't speak, only nodded and returned to work. Hours later, he found her standing by the trough, washing her hands, her sleeve rolled high enough to show faded scars, some new, some old, the kind that weren't made by accident. That night he cooked beans and bread on the stove. She sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around the tin plate. After a long pause, she said quietly, "You were a soldier." Eli looked up, surprised she'd noticed. He didn't answer, but his silence was enough. She nodded as if that alone explained the weariness in his eyes. Then she whispered, "They burned my father's barn. Said I was cursed for being born with this face." Her voice cracked. Eli didn't look at her out of pity. He just stared at the fire, because sometimes listening was harder than speaking. Later, when the moon rose, He handed her his rifle. "If they come," he said softly, "you'll need to know how to hold it." Her hands trembled, but she lifted it. He showed her where to rest her cheek, how to breathe before pulling the trigger. She missed every shot, but he didn't care. For a few minutes, she wasn't a victim. She was someone fighting to live. When the night grew colder, they sat outside the cabin, two shadows beneath a silver sky. Neither spoke, but in the stillness their silence turned into something almost holy. Pain had brought them together, but it was the shared quiet that began to heal them. Eli glanced at her, the firelight catching her eyes. Not beautiful by the world's measure, but fierce, alive, and unbroken. For the first time in years, he felt the ache of wanting someone to stay. It was near sundown when the dog started barking, a sound Eli hadn't heard in years, sharp and urgent, echoing through the empty fields like a warning. He was cleaning the lamp when he froze mid-motion, eyes shifting toward the door. May stiffened too, her hand gripping the edge of the table. Then came the rumble. Hooves against dirt, distant at first, then closer, faster. Eli set the lamp down, steady but silent. "Go inside," he said, his voice low but calm. She hesitated, her lips trembling. "Is it them?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Through the window, dust rose behind three riders. The first wore a brown hat and a black coat, the kind of man who smiled without warmth. The others followed close, rifles slung over their shoulders. They stopped a few yards from the porch. Eli stepped outside, shotgun resting easy in his arms. The man in the brown hat grinned. "Evening, Carter. Heard you been harboring something that don't belong to you." His voice was sweet as poison. Eli's jaw tightened. "Ain't harboring anyone," he said flatly. "Only thing here's my land." The man laughed, tipping his hat. "Then you won't mind if we look around." He nudged his horse forward, but Eli's gun lifted a fraction. "You cross that line," Eli said quietly, "and you won't cross back." The silence that followed was heavy enough to choke the wind. The man's smile faded. "You know who her daddy owed?" He hissed. "We own her life, Carter. You hand her over, we walk away." May was standing behind the window now, pale in the flickering light. Eli's eyes flicked to her, just once, and that was enough to decide everything. "You'll have to take her over my grave," he said. The first shot split the still air, tearing through the post near his head. Eli ducked, rolled behind the trough, returned fire, one shot clean, deliberate. A horse screamed. One of the men fell. May cried out inside but didn't run. Instead, she did what he taught her, loaded the second rifle and slid it through the window toward him. Her hands shook, but her aim was steady. When the dust cleared, two men lay still. The one in the brown hat was bleeding, crawling toward his gun. Eli approached slowly, breathing hard, the old war echoing in his chest. "You could have lived," Eli said softly. The man spat blood. "She ain't worth it." Eli's eyes darkened. "You're right," he murmured, lowering the rifle. "She's worth more." The last shot echoed across the hills, sharp, final, and hollow. When Eli turned back, May was standing in the doorway, tears mixing with dirt on her face. He looked at her, bruised, shaking, alive, and for the first time he smiled. "It's done," he said. But in his heart, he knew peace never comes without a cost. The horizon burned gold, and behind it, another night waited to fall. The world after the gunfire felt unreal. A silence so deep it rang in their ears. The dust still hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Eli stood over the man in the brown hat, his shadow long and thin in the fading light. The man was still breathing, just barely, blood pooling beneath him. May stood in the doorway, barefoot, her face half lit by the sinking sun. The rifle in her hands looked too heavy, too cruel, for someone who'd known nothing but fear. Eli lowered his weapon. For a moment he just watched the dying man's chest rise and fall, shallow, uneven, each breath clawing at the dirt for mercy. "He's done," Eli said quietly, almost to himself. May shook her head. "He won't stop." Eli didn't argue. He knew she was right, but there was something in his eyes, that tired look of a man who'd already seen enough endings. So instead of finishing it, he walked away. Mercy, he thought, was the only thing separating him from the men he buried. They dug graves behind the barn as the first stars broke through the twilight. The ground was hard, dry, resistant, like the land itself wanted to hold on to its sins. May worked beside him, her hands blistered, silent except for her breathing. When they were done, Eli covered the last mound with an old plank of wood. He didn't mark it. Some names didn't deserve remembering. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. May sat by the window watching the horizon, that endless stretch of darkness where the road disappeared. "You could have killed him," she said finally, voice small but steady. Eli nodded, sitting across from her. "I did, just slower." She looked at him, confused, and he added, "Men like him don't die once. They die every time the world forgets their name." Hours passed without words. He fixed her hand where a splinter had cut deep. She watched him quietly, the tension between them softening like frost under sunlight. Outside, the wind began to howl again, carrying away the echoes of violence. When it finally calmed, the ranch felt lighter, not safe, not yet, but alive. Before dawn, Eli saddled his horse. The bodies would draw scavengers, and the town would start asking questions. He turned to her. "We leave at first light," he said. She nodded, no fear in her eyes this time. As the sun crept up, painting the land gold once more, they rode away together, two souls bound not by fate, but by survival. Behind them, the cabin stood quiet, smoke rising from its chimney like a ghost's final breath. The war was over, but neither of them would ever be the same. Months passed before either of them spoke about that night again. The world beyond the ranch rolled on, as if nothing had happened. The wind still combed through the prairie grass. The rivers still whispered through the stones. But for Eli and May, every sunrise felt like borrowed time. They moved north, far from the town that whispered too much and helped too little. Together, they built a small cabin near the edge of a dry creek, where the land was quiet and the sky felt endless. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Eli worked the soil like a man trying to earn forgiveness from the earth itself. He grew corn, mended fences, and listened to the wind when it spoke. May tended the fire, cooked, and sometimes sang in a low, trembling voice that reminded him of peace, fragile, uncertain, but real. The scars on her face began to fade, though Eli knew the deeper ones never would. Still, when she smiled, it was enough to make the silence around them feel like a gift instead of a punishment. Sometimes she'd catch him staring at her while she worked. "Why do you look at me like that?" she'd ask, not with shame, but with quiet curiosity. Eli would just shake his head. "Because they were wrong," he'd say softly. "You were never too ugly to marry. You were just too strong for small men." She'd smile then, that shy, disbelieving smile, and the air between them would turn tender, heavy with the kind of truth that needed no words. Years later, when the rains returned after a long drought, Eli carved a small cross out of cedar and placed it by the creek, not for the men they buried, but for the people they used to be before finding each other. The wind tugged at his hat as he stood there, older now, slower, but peaceful in a way he never thought he'd earn. As the sun sank low, May stepped beside him, her hand finding his without searching. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The world had taken enough words from them, and as dusk wrapped around the fields like a blanket, Eli thought, some stories aren't meant to be told loud. Some are only meant to be lived, in quiet survival beneath an endless sky.